Today, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about agents, which is the most hyped thing, I think, around the internet, and quite possibly also the, in some ways controversial if it's working or not. But, before I say that, I'm Bálint. I'm CEO and co-founder and founder at Craft. And, one thing I wanted to start with is when DevBP started, it was quite important for us that this is an engineering meetup, okay? So we wanted to have engineers talking to engineers about professional topics. And I'm kind of, you might ask of, okay, then what do I do here? And kind of I'm happy to say I'm here because I still consider myself an engineer. I did have 1,700 comments or contributions last year. I don't know if that's good or bad, but hopefully I'm qualified to talk as an engineer to engineers. And the other thing is, we're Craft, we do this type of note-taking-y, writing, personal productivity tool. Why do we think that we can talk about agents, right? So how do we take the courage? And really, this January, we decided to tackle the same problem we're tackling with Craft, which is really personal productivity and organizing your life, but starting with a new product from a completely different angle, saying, how would we build Craft or solve this problem if we started today? And obviously a big chunk of that is how can we make computers smarter and behave more like you want them to behave. And in the last kind of 4 or 5 months, we spent a lot of time figuring this out, building agents. And it's been both a very fun time, both very stressful. And also I think we've learned so many things that as I've been talking with other people from other companies, it was just quite clear that this is quite interesting. Not that many people actually do these things, a lot about talk about them. So we thought we might have something interesting to show. So that's why we're here. And what I'm going to talk about is first, what are agents? Because that's not that clear often. Why are agents important? And how to build agents in that order. So first, what are agents? Well, I think there's no real consensus about that. So some companies will say, agents are things or software that acts on behalf of you. Other companies will say that, agents are these things that you will pay $20,000 a month, they will be PhD level, and they will be your new employees. But there's no strong definition of agents. It keeps changing, and it keeps changing every day, which is quite frustrating. But really, I think there is one thing where there is a stronger consensus around the entire industry, which is agents are things that use tools. And this is quite personal for us as humans because we became more than other species on the planet because we realized we can use tools to achieve our goals. And a little bit, that's how we think about agents of they are more than other software because they can figure out how to combine tools to reach their goals without us having to tell them. And before I jump into, okay, what are tools and how they work, I thought it would be nice to just give a high-level overview of really the last 2.5, 3 years of what I would call LLM wrapper evolution, right? So we had these LLMs appearing, and we started building software around them to achieve more and more. And just to clarify some things of how they work. So first, we do have this thing where we have an LLM in the center, you write a query and you get a response. Now, most of you already know this, that what happened is the query gets tokenized and essentially there's a prediction of what is statistically the most likely tokens come next. And what is really interesting is nowadays we interact with LLMs where they remember our conversations and everything, but fundamentally LLMs are stateless. So whenever you're talking to them, they don't have memory or anything like that. It's really just a stateless little thing. And this is how we all started. And this has been actually on the market for quite some while, and it didn't really spark big interest from most of the world. Then what happened is, So how would this look? Essentially, you ask, what does useState in React do? And it will give you an answer because it has been trained on that data. We know this quite well. Then what happened is ChatGPT and OpenAI figured this out of, hey, actually, if we send back the previous response in the query, it will have some type of conversational state, and And that could be quite good. And that's how most of us all learned what LLMs are and how they work. Essentially, if I visualize that, I can follow up that last request of should I use it. And because it sends back to the LLM the entire black rectangle thing, the LLM, despite being stateless, can explain to me of, yeah, it's a great question, and actually know what you're talking about when all you ask is, should I use it? This is also still quite basic. Then there was this big hype about RAG, retrieval augmented generation or something. I might not say that right, but really, we realized of, oh my God, this thing can answer questions. And I wanted to be able to put it in front of users so they can ask questions. The only problem with that is it doesn't know a lot about my business or my domain. So I need to feed information to it. And back at like 1.5 years ago, there was this thing called the context window, which is still there, but back in the time it was quite small. And essentially the way you could get the LLM to know something about your stuff, because it's stateless, is you needed to add in that context window additional information, which you did a search before and you embedded that there. And this was a very big thing of how you find the right amount of information, squeeze it in a small window. And if I look of how this technically looked is, let's say you have this question of, what does my custom class in my code base do, right? And the basic LLM does not know anything about your code base, but if you put a search in front of the LLM, it can search for my custom class. If it finds it, it can add it to the query, send it to the LLM, and it can answer that. And again, there was a big thing around RAG and vector databases and how this is the future. What happened nowadays is because context windows are so big, you just tend to snap with a more brute force search into whatever you need, and it has the results. So kind of as fast as RAG became the top thing on GitHub with 50,000 stars on every vector database, just as quickly, I think engagement is dropping. And now we're approaching to the next hype cycle, which may stay or may not, we don't know, which is agents, which we're here to talk about. Now, the way agents work is, first there was this thing called function calling, and then we start calling that tool calling, essentially, where you tell the LLM of, by the way, you have access to these tools. So you can have a search tool and a web browse tool, and if it can then answer that, hey, I now want to use the web browse tool, and give me back the results to that. So what, for instance, an agent could do with tools is, I might, just want to send an email to Akush that, hey, I'm late. And if I just say this, any of you would ask me, okay, dude, who is Akush, and how do I send an email, right? And if you give an LLM a tool so it can look up a contact and it can, send an email, it can figure out that that is what it needs to do. It will query that contact information, it will give that back, it will use the email tool. And there are fun stuff in these conversations like, I can come back an hour later and ask, did he respond? And since it does have this chat type contextual memory, and it does have tools like email tool it can use, it can get back to me. So this is now starting to get more of, okay, there might be actually some more value here than just basic chat. But really, going back to that initial question of what are agents, it's really about they can use tools and combine them to figure out how they get to the end goal. So specifically in this example, I think, I just said, send an email to Akush that I'm late, right? I just specified the end goal, where normally with a computer, I would have to specify how I want to reach to the end goal. And this is the really interesting thing about them, if they can combine tools and be creative of how to use this. So that's cool, right? So it's a new technology. I can now send emails, a little bit better Siri. Why is this important specifically for developers, right? Now, again, it depends a lot on who you ask. Some people will say this will help cure cancer. Others will say that, you will get a better Siri. But really, I think our take is agents can help us create a different type of both computer-computer interface. Like, we used to have SOAP envelopes, then we have JSON APIs, and maybe this is the next thing. But also, we think it can help us create a different human-computer interface. So I guess a lot of you, work in companies where you need to request holidays, and you have an amazing HR tool which has stellar UI. And the biggest fun of your life is logging into that tool, finding that button of how do you submit a holiday request, and doing that. Well, probably this should, go back to a Slack message or whatever instant messenger you're using, where you just say, hey, file a request for this. And then, that agent would go out, say you're on it, ask for the approval from your manager, get back to you, and you could even tell it, hey, and book out my calendar. So there's a lot of UIs and frontends out there that don't really need to exist, or the other way I'd say it, people will want to start interacting it in different ways. We used to have desktop, then mobile, then responsive design, and I really think if you're an engineer who does any type of code which interacts with users, you will start having requests for agentic UIs or this new type of interaction, so you will have to think about how do you handle them. The next thing is very interesting. So we've seen this evolution in programming of how we moved from assembly and binary code up to now coding is a little bit like English. And maybe, coding will be a lot more like English, essentially. There's vibe coding where you just write a sentence of what you do, but kind of as engineers, we know you need to be a little bit more specific, oftentimes, of what you do. So maybe more specific means I just don't need to care about what is the exact parameter specification of that login service. I can just say, here's the username, password, use it to log in. And then maybe the compiling time would translate it to, a more lower level call, or maybe dynamically, runtime in LLM would execute it. I don't know. But we already see these MCP servers of you can interact with databases via MCP, which is just, you give a freeform string, and it tries to figure out what you want to do with the freeform string. And I don't know if this is good or bad, or is this going to result in lower quality code. But I think it is coming, right? So agentic APIs, which you can interact more or differently, is going to come. So we talked about what are agents, why are they important? And now comes the fun stuff of how do you build agents? Because to be honest, I don't think we interacted with that many agents, right? We hear a lot about agents, but I struggle to find, a single agent I can use every day, despite, my Twitter feed being full of agents. So what's happening here? And again, this is a very heated topic of what are agents, how do you build them? I think the LangChain CTO just had a viral Twitter thread criticizing the OpenAI white paper about how to build agents, contrasting that to the Anthropic white paper of how to build agents, because all of them say different things on how you should build agents. But the good thing is quite simple, right? So there are two main components about agents. There is an LLM, which can make tool calls. So ideally, this is a more modern LLM, not GPT 3.5, but 4.0, these now support function calling, tool calling. And then you have an agent framework, which is really just what I would call the old school type of code we all write, which connects these LLM tool calls. But if I go down to a more code level, and apologies, this is no specific language, but hopefully it simulates how a very simple agent could look like, is you have an agent that gets a query as an input. You define a tool. This specific agent has an email tool, right? And it can figure out what it can do with that. You call the LLM, and if the LLM response begins with email tool, you just pass the response to the email tool, and then do the recursion of calling back the agent with the query, and the response of the agent tool. This is fundamentally a very, very simple agent, and that part is the agent framework or agent SDK. And there's tons of complexities and how complex you can go. But at the very basic thing, if you look at a hello world type of thing, this could be the most basic thing. So in some ways, it's actually quite simple. Now, the problem is it's not that simple, right? Because LLMs are indeterministic. like they say they're amazing with tool callings, and you download these, frameworks which have 50,000 GitHub stars. I mean, 50,000 GitHub stars must work, right? It doesn't work. The documentation at least is good, it's not good. Kind of you realize, you start to talk with people, and because there's so much VC funding, people buy GitHub stars, because if you got a lot of GitHub stars, you might get VC funding. So I think there's this whole type of promised land here happening. And then tool calling, it's amazing. If you have one tool or two tools, like I showed you, it works like magic. You give 6 tools, and the LLM cannot figure out which one to call. I mean, it's smart, but not that smart. So it's just, yeah. It's the future, right? But we're not there yet. Hopefully we'll be there soon. But the reality is that, today it's how we feel. And I think a month ago, we were in this situation of, we were like, oh shit, now what are we gonna do? What's gonna happen? And before giving up and saying, hey, we got lost in the hype cycle and there's no way you can build agents, we had an idea, right? There are clearly very few things that work out there. Like there's Cursor and Windsurf and some very basic tools that are agentic and they do some stuff. For instance, for us, I think engineers, it's kind of magical what they do. So we said, why don't we take a look at what they do? I mean, they must know something. They raise hundreds of millions of funding. They must know something. So we said, why don't we think about looking at these tools and figuring out what they're doing, right? So yeah, they're using Pluribuff, so you need to, start looking into a little bit more details. And I don't think I use Wireshark, the last time it was like 15 years ago, but it turns out like, they did teach us something at university that is applicable for what you want to do. And kind of what we realized when looking at all of these things is, the LLM is not that good with tool calls, but it's really good with code generation. And you know what? It's really good at handling the terminal, right? The Unix terminal, like CLI, there's all sorts of bash names for this, but it's not only really good at figuring out how to use it, how to write really specific commands, but when it gets an error message, it's really good at recovering that. Because it's like, if you are born in Hungary and you are raised in Hungary, you're quite good at Hungarian, right? And then you are taught a second language, and you're never going to be that fluent. I'm going to make mistakes in English, despite, I keep talking. And I think LLMs are a little bit like that. They grew up on this training data of code and terminal and CLI, and they're quite good with that. And then I try to teach them tools, and it's like, yeah, I get it, but, I have a limited memory, and, how does that work? Like a really interesting example is you give the LLM a file search tool. You explain what the file search tool is. You give it a syntax, how to use it, and it will do okay, but mainly terrible. You do the same thing, but you say, dude, you're a grep tool. Just use the grep syntax, and it's gonna be amazing. It's just gonna, do the most complex regular expressions inside of their very complex things perfectly. And we said, let's try this, how it works. And it works very well. Like, some of the fun stuff it did is, obviously we needed to, set up a virtual machine in the cloud so it can execute on that. But we had this example where we misconfigured the setup. And it should have had the ability to create a new file in the file system, but we screwed up and it didn't have. And this was a food/drink tracking agent, so kind of Bartek there, he loves to track coffees, and he wanted to try this out, and he said, I just had this type of coffee. And the agent said, okay, what I need to do, I'm tracking this type, so for every item I create a new markdown file, so I need to create a new markdown file. It tried to do that, but of course it had an error. And instead of going back to the user and saying, hey, I couldn't do that, it said, what else can I do? And it started listing, the file system, looking at contents. It figured out it has write access on a hidden template file, or not hidden, but kind of intended to be hidden template file. And it can actually write inside of that and, still do its task. And it did that. Now, it's a question if I want as a user to do that or not. But it's, there's this weird thing that when your, kids start doing something and you realize they're smart, right? I think these are those moments when it's naughty, it shouldn't do that, but it's smart. And I think these are some of those moments when you realize this is exciting, this is something, and there's definitely something we can work with here because it is smart. I have to admit, that's a good idea. even if it's not intended to. And kind of that is one of the reasons why a lot of the things which work today are either running on your local machines or on the cloud on a virtual machine. So when you look at some agents like Manus, they are running on virtual machines, and when you look at Cloud Code, Windsurf, essentially Cursor, they all kind of use your own file system. And they run on that part of things, and that's where they execute things. Eventually this might change, but this is what we see today. But of course, there's going to be a lot more about these code editors in the next presentation. Also though, I'm telling this, but maybe you go home tomorrow and this is all changed because we have new models coming up, and specifically companies are addressing this challenge of models not following instructions, models not being able to call tools. And what they're saying, and kind of what we're seeing as well, is for instance, O3, the latest model from OpenAI, is getting pretty darn good in tool calling. So maybe tomorrow you don't need a CLI and you don't need a virtual computer to run effective agents. We don't know. But I think this is just a reminder that in this space of, usually you have companies where you write code and it's only going to become tech debt in a decade, right? Because you write it in C++ and it's always going to be around, or maybe it's kind of an IP now and it's never going to become tech debt. Most of us, when you work in a SaaS company or things like that, every code is becoming tech debt in between 7 to 2 years time, ideally more on the 7-year time. And then the AI space, it's kind of weeks. Right? So in weeks, you become tech debt, whatever you write, and maybe in 3 months, the entire model you're working against is going to be retired. So it is a very dynamic type of thing, so probably everything I say here next week isn't going to work. Now, if you want to go into the details of how agents work, we're engineers, so we create architectures around everything, and there's so many ways to set up agents and orchestrate them. There might be that you have kind of an agent at top who's smart and can distribute tasks and calls different agents. There might be ways where you can parallelize, request and do all of those. There might be ways where you don't trust an agent, right? Because LLMs tend to hallucinate. So you have kind of another agent which checks if it's hallucinating or not. And, most of the time it's going to work. Sometimes it's not. So kind of it's like, for a company, you need to have somebody who does the books and the accounting, and you need to have somebody who checks the accounting from the books so the investors know that you're not lying. This is the same model. But there's tons and tons of these architectures, and you can go very deep inside of that. But actually what we're exploring and what we're seeing is that the models are becoming better, and a lot of these architectures are really just collapsing into calling them like the ChatGPT way, where you call the same model again and again and again, and it's kind of really feels like for us that whenever you kind of try to fix with clever solutions the shortcoming of the models you have right now, the next release will just have your problem solved, and most of your infrastructure is thrown away. So it's a very interesting thing to decide, should I do anything with agents or should I just wait a couple of months because it's just gonna be a lot better? And I think kind of that is my main takeaway here of, first of all, agents are, for me, insanely fun. I don't think I had so much fun in a long time because it's so dynamic and they can do things I would never expect a computer to do. And they are starting to work. They're not working just yet, but they are starting to work, which is quite fun. The other problem is, it's very hard as a business owner, a manager, even you as an engineer, dedicating your time to go deep inside of agents and figure out what they do, because what you learn now in 3 months, it might be just trash because the whole world is changing. So it's kind of a very interesting dynamic there. Although I personally really believe that it's going to be a big part of the future. It's going to be a big part of how we work and how computer systems interact. So if I were you, I would kind of keep a close eye on it, maybe try to do some of your very basic examples periodically to figure out if it's something that interests you. And a very interesting thing is that already O3, which we use as ChatGPT, they don't brand it as agents, but it's very agentic. It has now, I think, a number of 4 or 5 tools, which it uses very cleverly, and that's a big part of why it's a lot better to chat with. So to summarize what we talked about, what are agents? There are these things that can use tools to, come to the end goals. Why are they important? Well, we think it's a new interface, human-computer, computer-computer interface. And how to build agents? Well, it's kind of changes every day, but it's quite fun. Kind of, I think that is the key parts of this. And all of this is very experimental, as I said. Now, closing slide. If I didn't scare you away from building agents and you're looking to build agents, we are looking people to help us build agents. So this is the we're hiring type of slide. But also, there is one agent that we actually started using in production, and that is an agent that does an interview with candidates. Now, all of you in the little thing you got, there's a QR code, and you can sign up for an interview, which we will share all of the end results with you and everything we see it. So it's mainly for you. If you want to have your first interaction with an actual agent and an actual, AI, which is not, high stakes, but for fun, feel free to try it and do it. I think it's quite interesting.